2020 is a difficult year for everyone. However you look at it, coronavirus has paralysed pretty much everything. Despite this, take note, because everything points to the Middle East giving us a lot to talk about in the near future. And look, we're not exactly talking about good news, we're talking about crises, conflict, and deep-rooted clashes. Just normal for the Middle East, I guess then. How could it get even worse in 2020? Well, friends of VisualPolitik, prepare for a new episode in the eternal conflict between Israel and Palestine. A nice, easy video for one of my first videos. Totally non-controversial. Thanks very much, guys. For decades, the Israelis and Palestinians have accumulated more than enough reasons to fight. And lucky them, now there's a new one. I'm talking about the so-called Deal of the Century, the Trump administration's plan to supposedly achieve peace between Israel and Palestine. And I say supposedly because it seems for now that what Trump is doing is pushing Israel and Palestine to their most critical moment in the last 40 years. And let's remember, they've had a lot of critical moments in the last 40 years. If no one prevents it, Israel is finally going to annex Jewish settlements on the West Bank. In other words, it will incorporate into the Israeli state a part of the territory that has historically been considered as a part of a hypothetical Palestinian state. And this brings up several questions. What is happening in the Middle East? Are we really facing the deal of the century? Does Trump's plan have winners and losers? And why does Israel want to annex Jewish settlements? More importantly than all of that though, why does the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict seem farther away than ever? Here on VisualPolitik and in this video, we will answer all these questions. But first, let's look at some history.
Seven decades of conflict.
To really understand this conflict, it is essential to travel back to the first half of the 20th century. At that time, anti-Semitism was growing in Europe, so more and more Jews migrated to the land of their ancestors. As you can imagine, this type of migration really accelerated after World War II. The horrors of the Holocaust increased the Jewish exodus to Palestine. The Jewish people were very clear that they needed their own state. At that time, Palestine was under British rule, and the problems between the Arabs and the Jews were increasing. So, the United Nations took up the matter with one of the most famous resolutions in its entire history, Resolution 181. This resolution was one in which the UN proposed to divide Palestine into two states. One of 14,000 square kilometers under Hebrew rule, in which there would be a 60% Jewish population, but also a 40% Arab population. The other, slightly smaller state of 11,000 square kilometers would be that of the Palestinian people, where the Jews would represent only 2% of the population. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the other holy places were also placed under international rule. The Jews accepted the resolution, but not the Arabs. And that is how a conflict that has spread over the last 7 decades began. To give you an idea, the day after proclaiming its independence, Israel was invaded by the joint armies of 5 Arab countries. Of course, the outcome of this contest was a clear victory for the Jewish army, a victory with which Israel expanded its territory another 40%. And this is very important, because the expanded borders of the 1949 armistice are what the United Nations now accepts. At that time, the Arabs gave up proclaiming the state of Palestine in such a way that Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip and Jordan ended up with the West Bank. The situation remained so until 1967, the so-called Six-Day War, a war that resulted in a new victory for the Israeli army. This time, Israel took over the Golan Heights on the borders with Syria, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank to place the border with Jordan on the River Jordan. Clever naming there. Egypt was also robbed of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. Since then, there have been more wars, such as the Yom Kippur or the Lebanese Wars, but there was also a time in between to negotiate. The most successful negotiations were those that took place in the Camp David agreements with Egypt. Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and it was to be the only territory that regained the same status as it had prior to 1967. In the early 1980s, Israel definitively annexed the Golan Heights. Then the Jerusalem Act recognized the entirety of the Holy City as its capital. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, the various conservative and progressive governments of Israel opted for the route of fait accompli and pushed forward with the construction of tens and tens, even hundreds of Jewish settlements. We discussed this issue in detail in a video that I'll link in the description. The fact is that with these settlements, Israel directly defied international law. But why? Because the Geneva Convention expressly prohibits the transfer of civilian populations to military-occupied territories. The point is that it is precisely Israel's policy towards East Jerusalem and the settlements that are drawn on the horizon that will be crucial in order to reach an agreement that will resolve this conflict once and for all. Then, for its part, the Palestinian response only contributed to making matters worse. Under Yasser Arafat, for years the Palestinian Liberation Organization's attacks and violent actions multiplied, and it was not until the 1990s that Palestine sat down to negotiate with the Hebrew state in Madrid and in Oslo. There, he made advances towards self-government in Palestine, but in practice, it was still very limited. If one thing seemed clear, then it was that the solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict would be the so-called two-state solution. However, in the last 25 years, very little progress has been made. Israel has not stopped building settlements, and the Palestinians have not ended the violence. And their violent actions have never delivered the results that they actually wanted. In fact, if there is one thing we can highlight during the last 25 years, it is precisely that Israel has been the clear victor in this dispute, and we're not just speaking from a military point of view. For example, as we saw in this video, relations of the Hebrew state with Arab countries are now better than ever. In addition, Arafat's death divided the Palestinians into two separate factions. On one hand, his Fatah heirs, who dominate the West Bank, and on the other, the radical Hamas, the Palestinian arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, that has control of the Gaza Strip. Two factions that are continually fighting each other over the Palestinian leadership. So you see that while Palestine has had a very weak leadership, in Israel the exact opposite has been true, especially during the last 11 years, when the country has been ruled by Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest serving prime minister in the entire history of the country. And then, as if that wasn't complicated enough, we drop Donald Trump right into the middle of the picture. Check this out.
Today's agreement is a historic opportunity for the Palestinians to finally achieve an independent state of their very own.
The deal of the century?
Now look, no one asked him to, but Trump began his presidency by committing to do everything that he could to achieve ultimate peace between Israel and Palestine. It's what's become known as, in Trumpian language, the deal of the century. That was 3 years ago. Since then, a lot has happened, and it's not clear that any of his actions have contributed the slightest to bringing peace closer together, or at least facilitating negotiations. The decision to move the US embassy to Jerusalem was a turning point in this attempt to improve a completely stalled peace process.
On December 6, 2017, at my direction, the United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel. Today we follow through on this recognition and open our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
The Trump administration directly challenged a 1980 UN Security Council resolution, a resolution calling on countries to withdraw their diplomatic missions from Jerusalem as a protest measure for Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem. Of course, the lack of Arab response exposed the weakness of Palestinian political movements. Fatah broke off any negotiations with the United States, but no one listened to them. The Hamas radicals called for a third intifada, but luckily, no one listened to them either. Meanwhile, other countries showed that this conflict matters less and less to them, and that they have other, much more important priorities, such as the clash with Iran, and other matters that the US and Israel have in common. Not to mention, moreover, that other countries are not really in a position to demand very much either. For example, Put yourself in the place of, I don't know, Saudi Arabia. Imagine Prince Salman calling the White House to protest. Hey, Donald, I think it's terrible. It's really, really bad that you've put your embassy in Jerusalem. Can you imagine Trump's answer? Well, what can I say, Mohammed? You whacked Khashoggi. Actually, now you mention it, I've really got to go. And that would be the end of it.
Toward peace. I mean, we're looking seriously at peace and maybe ultimately peace in the whole of the Middle East.
The fact is that the deal of the century, in spite of everything, moved forward. Of course, it's nothing like what it was cracked up to be, in much the same way as Trump's entire presidency has turned out. Let me explain. For starters, a plan that has never included the Palestinians cannot be called an agreement. But not only will the new agreement not bring peace, but everything indicates that it would cause the conflict to erupt again. Why? Well, in the US, they're pretty clear about it. Check it out.
Trump releases Mideast peace plan that strongly favors Israel, New York Times.
The Trump administration's plan breaks international law, UN resolutions, and 60 years of US diplomacy. The deal of the century, ladies and gentlemen. No half measures. Trump approaches the problem by backing all the demands of Israel and none of the Palestinians. Well, not exactly none. The Palestinians want their capital in East Jerusalem, no problem. However, East and West are sort of relative concepts for Trump. So he took a map and he said, let's see, these two wards in the East, East Jerusalem, job done, there you are. This is going to be the capital that the Palestinians claim. Problem solved. Who wants to go and get McDonald's? And it's basically the only concession, if you can even call it that. So the question is, does Trump think the Palestinians were going to take this lying down? Well, no. That's why he simply pulled out the checkbook and promised them $50 billion in aid to develop the future Palestinian state. The Palestinian answer? You can probably guess, but here it is.
أريد أن أقول للثنائي ترامب ونتنياهو إن القدس ليست للبيع.
Now, according to the borders accepted by the UN, those drawn from the 1949 armistice, the Palestinians would stay in the Gaza Strip and occupy 70% of the West Bank. In addition, they have been promised that both territories would be connected by an underground tunnel. But any resemblance to a country is pure coincidence. The West Bank that the Trump agreement proposes would be a kind of Swiss cheese, with towns connected to each other by isolated roads, through tunnels, flyovers, police checks, and so on. And that is the best case scenario. But pay attention, because the main contribution of the White House's plan is truly shocking. Now, how could the Palestinians be compensated if Israel gets 30% of the West Bank? How can we compensate the Palestinian state for turning it into a kind of Swiss cheese, with territories connected to each other by literal labyrinths, and without even having full competition in terms of ports or airports? How can we compensate them for Israel holding on to the fertile Jordan Valley and almost all of the water sources? Well, Trump saw it very clearly. He took a map again and said, let's see, I see an area here in Israel that is empty. Why don't we give that to the Palestinians? Problem solved. Let's all go get McDonald's. And then, I'm sure some advisor who understood Israeli issues a little more clearly than the president, which to be fair could be literally any advisor, said to him, but Mr. President, there's nothing in that area because it's the Negev desert. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine Trump's reaction? What it possibly might be?
I'm sorry, you're fired. Get out of here.
Anyway, who knows? But at this point, the question we should really ask ourselves is, in a hypothetical, parallel universe where the Palestinians accepted this deal, something they've already said no to in this actual real world, would there finally be an independent Palestinian state? And the answer is no. Because you see, Trump's plan says that in 4 years, and if they've been very good, then, well, maybe they could form a state. By the way, a state with only partial sovereignty. It would be a demilitarized state with no control over its borders or airspace. They wouldn't even be free to allow the president's plane to take off. As you can imagine, the Israelis today are delighted. But in the long run, all this will bring them problems. What kind of problems? Check this out.
The Age of Regret.
There is no doubt, Israel is enjoying a golden era. For many years now, their existence has not been threatened. Palestinians are giving them fewer and fewer problems, their economy has experienced an incredible boom, and it has become a paradise for startups. And on top of that, they now have Washington completely on side. And yes, some may be thinking, but wait a minute, Grant, hasn't the United States always been an important ally for Israel? Well, yes, it has, but Trump has gone much, much further. For example, Trump has acknowledged the annexation of the Golan Heights, the annexation of East Jerusalem, and its distinction as Israel's capital. He's cut aid to the Palestinians and closed their diplomatic mission in Washington. So the question is there anything he skipped in sinking the morale of the Palestinians? Well, yes, and that's what the US Secretary of State was in charge of. Listen to what Mike Pompeo has to say.
The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law.
Now, as you can imagine, the Palestinians have not been best pleased with this. They've said 1,000 times that they don't want to even hear from Trump. But of course, when you consider that Netanyahu has not spoken out either way about giving up an area of the Negev, then you wonder, why on earth has the Trump administration drawn up a plan that no one wants? And why, considering that, would you call it the deal of the century? Well, in the end, what this all boils down to is very simple, and it's summarized best here.
Donald Trump gives Israel the green light to annex occupied lands, The Economist.
Now, all of this has occurred at a very turbulent time for Israeli politics. Netanyahu has been a solid leader over the last decade, but Israel's electoral system is so complicated that it practically always forces large coalitions comprising many disparate parties. And, as you can imagine, constant negotiation is extremely exhausting. Just ask my girlfriend. And Netanyahu had a tough time last year. Things got so complicated that he has to face 3 elections in a row for failing to reach a sufficient majority to govern. And in the end, he had to make a deal with his main political adversary, which is never a good thing. Just ask my girlfriend.
Netanyahu and Gantz agree to form unity Israeli government. Prime Minister will remain in office for 18 months before handing position to his rival, The Guardian.
Under this agreement, Netanyahu will cease to be Israel's Prime Minister in November 2021. And that leads us to think that he's very clear about what he wants his legacy to be. The annexation of the West Bank, partially occupied by Jewish settlements.
Unity deal allows Prime Minister to begin advancing West Bank annexation from July 1st, times of Israel.
A pretense that, as we have already seen, has been driven by the explicit endorsement of Trump himself. However, Israel should be prepared for the consequences this annexation could trigger. A Palestinian state, like the one Trump's proposed, would hardly be viable. It would be more like a Swiss cheese than what we would recognise as a country. And how attractive would that be? Who would invest in a country that doesn't even control its borders or its airspace? In a country that is subject to all kinds of external controls? What viable future could it possibly have? Ending the two-state solution by annexing the West Bank could bring with it a resumption of violence in the area. And let's be very clear, a future without a Palestinian state is not a good thing for Israel. It involves perpetuating the conflict with the consequent economic and military cost while inflicting massive, significant human damage on Palestine. Because, when it comes down to it, the current situation basically means that the Palestinians are condemned forever to poverty. Now look, Israel is the only solid democracy in this area of the world, and it is also a technological power whose contribution to the development of humanity is more than remarkable. It's something we've talked about previously on VisualPolitik, but that shouldn't and doesn't mean that they have carte blanche for everything. In any case, dear listeners, if there's one thing that's clear, it's that Trump's plan for peace today is anything but a peace deal. Now, it's up to you guys. Do you think this eternal conflict will one day find a solution? What do you think of the Trump administration's proposal? And finally, do you think Netanyahu will eventually dare to annex the West Bank? Leave your answer in the comments below. We really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos that are coming out every week. If you click the little button down there, you'll get updates whenever we release a new one. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not my dulcet tones. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.